That old Alice is worth nothing, Walter. Sentimental junk. Tom Pickard said it the way he said most things. Easy, certain. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years pricing equipment and had not yet been seriously wrong. He was standing at his dealership tent at the Kendall County Fairgrounds at 9:15 in the morning. The Texas hill country already warm around them, cedar and livestock, and the smell of fried food coming off the trailers that had been set up before sunrise. He had his arms crossed. He was looking across the show ring at a 1957 Allis-Chalmers WD-45 that stood in the morning light in Persian orange paint. I offered her $800 for it 2 years ago, he said to the dealer beside him. She turned me down to pour money into a hobby. The WD-45 was 40 feet away. The paint was not the dull orange of a machine that had sat through decades in a Texas barn. It was deep, precise, original formula Persian orange, the Alice factory color, sourced from a restoration supply house in Ohio, and it caught the morning light in a way that stopped some people as they walked past the ring. The decals were new, but correct. The engine bay was polished. There was not a smear or a fingerprint on it. Loretta Greer was standing beside the tractor, with one hand resting on the hood. She was 65 years old, in her good jeans and a blue blouse, and she was watching Tom Pickard's display tent with an expression that gave nothing away. Behind her, 2 steps back, stood a man named Harold Eames. He was 74 years old, and he had driven down from San Marcos the previous evening and was holding a folder flat against his side. He was watching the judge's table at the end of the ring. Tom walked over to the show ring rope. "Nice paint job, Loretta," he said. "Still, nobody's going to pay serious money for a WD-45. It's not a row crop. It's not a 2-cylinder. It's just old." Loretta looked at him. She said, "Thank you, Tom." But what Tom Pickard didn't know, hadn't thought to find out, was who Harold Eames was. Harold was the most respected antique tractor appraiser in the state of Texas. He had been judging restoration classes at county and state fairs for 11 years. He held a national certification and had consulted on estate appraisals, insurance valuations, and collector purchases in 8 states. And that folder under his arm contained a signed appraisal document for the WD-45 standing in the ring. The number on the document was $38,000. Do you know that feeling when someone tells you a thing you love isn't worth anything, and you've already decided to prove, not to them, but to yourself, that it is? Let's go back to the morning Loretta found the WD-45 in her grandfather's barn and the offer Tom Pickard drove out to make. Earl Whiting had died in February of 2020. He was 89 years old and had farmed in Kendall County for 60 years, and the farm had been his life and the measure of his days. He left it in a trust that distributed to 5 heirs, most of whom had grown up in cities and had not thought much about the land or its contents in years. Loretta was his granddaughter, his only grandchild, who had stayed in the hill country, and she was named executor. She spent March sorting through the farm. She handled the house first, then the tool sheds, then the 2 barns. In the back barn, under a canvas tarp that had not been moved in years, she found the WD-45. It was not a dramatic discovery in the way that people sometimes describe finding something valuable. The tarp was stiff, with age and brittle at the edges. The tractor under it was the color of primer, where the original paint had gone, which was most of the surface. The tires were flat and cracked. She could see, even in the barn's poor light, that the engine had not been run in a long time. She found a coffee can on the shelf above the workbench. Inside it was a folded piece of carbon paper, the original 1957 receipt. Alice Chalmers WD-45, serial K117482, sold to Earl Whiting, April 14, 1957, $2,100. She stood in the barn for a while, with the receipt in her hand. She had been 12 years old the last time she remembered seeing this tractor running. Her grandfather had used it for light work around the farm, mowing, hauling brush, running the post-hole digger. He had kept it because it was useful, and because he had bought it new, and because it was his. When the newer, larger tractor arrived in the late 1980s, the WD-45 went to the back barn. And there it had stayed for 30 years. She called Tom Picard that afternoon. Not to sell it, she didn't know yet what she wanted to do with it, but because she thought he might know what it was worth in its current condition, and what it would cost to restore it. Tom drove out the following morning. He walked around the tractor. He looked at the engine. He lifted the hood. He looked at the dash plate with the serial number. K117482, he said. Right here. WD-45 was the last of the WD line before they went to the D series. He looked at the tires. He looked at the paint. He lifted one of the flat tires slightly and let it drop. I'll give you $800 for it, as is, he said. That's scrap steel by weight, plus a little for the parts. I'd be doing you a favor. Costs more than that to haul off what you can't sell. What would it cost to restore it? Loretta asked. He looked at her with a patience that was nearly kindness and might have been condescension. Loretta, a WD-45 in original condition sells at auction for $1,000 to $1,500 if you're lucky and the buyer has a reason to want it. You'd spend $8,000 to $10,000 getting it there. Minimum, it doesn't pencil out. Thank you, she said. I'll be in touch. He drove away. She went inside and called the Hill Country Antique Power Association. The association put her in touch with a retired mechanic named Curtis Bell, who lived outside Comfort and had rebuilt half a dozen old Alice Chalmers machines over the course of his career. She drove out to meet him on a Thursday. He was 68 years old, deliberate and careful, with a shop that smelled of oil and metal and the kind of orderliness that comes from decades of precision work. She showed him the photographs she had taken of the WD-45. He looked at them for a while and asked 3 questions. What was the engine's condition? Had anyone touched the hydraulics recently? And did she have the original receipt? She answered, seized but probably salvageable no and yes. Bring it here, he said. I'll tell you more when I can see it. She trailered the WD-45 to Curtis's shop the following week. He spent 2 hours going over it and then came out of the shop and told her the engine block was sound. The hydraulic pump was original and would likely rebuild. The electrical was simple enough. The cosmetics were the bigger project. The paint was gone to bare metal in most places, which meant a full strip and prime before she could get to the finish coat. What's your total budget? He asked. I don't have one yet, she said. What's it going to take? 5,000 to 7,000 in parts and materials, he said. My labor, I'll work with you on. The cosmetics are on you. I'll do the mechanical and you do the bodywork. That's if you want to learn it. She said she did. He said, all right. Let's start with the engine. The mechanical rebuild took the better part of a year, working on weekends when both of them were available and on the occasional weekday when Curtis had time and Loretta drove down from the farm. The engine came apart, the bore checked and found within spec, the rings replaced, the carburetor rebuilt. Curtis had sourced a nose carburetor kit from a parts supplier in Indiana that still stocked original Alice Chalmers components. The hydraulic pump rebuilt cleanly. The electrical was elementary. A 6-volt system, a magneto-ignition, components that any competent mechanic could service without a computer. While the mechanical work progressed, Loretta worked on the body in the evenings in her own barn. She bought a wire brush and a grinder and a random orbit sander, and she stripped the primer and old paint from the sheet metal herself, section by section, starting with the hood, because it was the most visible and she wanted to get it right first. It was slow, physical work. She was not, she would be the first to say, a natural at it. The first panel she stripped took her 4 evenings. The second took 2. She had never thought of herself as mechanical. Her husband Wes had been the one who understood equipment. Their farm's machinery had been his domain, and she had handled the house and the books and the livestock and had left the engines to him. When Wes died in 2018, she had managed the farm's mechanical needs by hiring out or calling Curtis on other jobs. She had not expected, at 63 years old, to take up body restoration as a skill. But the work had its own logic. It rewarded patience and attention, and the willingness to do the same thing slowly and correctly, rather than quickly and wrong. She found, to her surprise, that she was good at it. She sourced the paint from the Ohio restoration supplier that the association had recommended, Alice Chalmers Persian Orange, formula matched to the 1957 factory spec. A color that was slightly more red-orange than the standard orange most people thought of when they thought of Alice Chalmers machines. She tested it on a small panel before committing to the full machine. The color was right. The Hill Country Antique Power Association sent her a copy of a restoration standards guide they had compiled. Specifications for correct decal placement, hardware finishes, correct ignition and electrical components for each model year. She read it cover to cover twice. She ordered the decals from a specialist in Wisconsin who produced exact spec reproductions. One evening, in the second year of the project, she was sitting in the barn on a hay bale with the hood panel in her lap, working a particularly stubborn rust spot at the forward edge with fine-grained sandpaper. The barn was quiet. The light over the workbench made a warm pool in the middle of the barn. She had been at it for 2 hours, and the rust spot was almost there. She thought about Earl. She thought about him driving this tractor in 1957, brand new, the paint bright and the engine tight and the whole life of the machine ahead of it. She thought about him putting it in this barn in 1989 and covering it with the tarp and not going back. She did not know why he had not gone back. Maybe the newer tractor was simply more useful. Maybe the old one became, gradually, a thing too associated with an earlier part of his life to think about easily. That happened with objects. They accumulated meaning, and sometimes the meaning was too heavy to carry around, and you covered it with a tarp. She took the rust spot down to bare metal. She primed it. She set the panel aside to dry. She was not doing this for Tom Pickard. That was important to remember. Tom Pickard was an irrelevance. She was doing this because the machine had been her grandfather's and was now hers, and because bringing a thing back from the point of abandonment was, she had come to understand, something she needed to do. She did not have a better explanation than that. She did not think she needed one. Harold Eames drove to the farm in the spring of 2021, about 10 months into the project. He had heard about it through the association. Word moved through antique tractor circles the way it moved through any small community, thoroughly and fast, and he had called to ask if he could come by and have a look. He arrived in a truck that was clean but well used, the truck of a man who went to a lot of barns. He was 72 then, slow in his movements but sharp in his looking. He walked around the WD-45. At that point, the body was stripped and primed, and the mechanical rebuild was underway. And he looked at the engine, and he looked at the frame, and he looked at the serial number on the dash plate, and he crouched down and looked at the underside of the frame rail near the front axle. He stood up. He said, "This is the original frame, not welded." "Yes," Loretta said. "Original engine block?" "Yes." Curtis checked the bore. "It's in spec." He looked at the machine for another long moment. Then he said, "This is worth doing. Do it right and I'll come back." He came back twice more. The second visit was the following fall, when the mechanical work was complete and the paint was half done. He looked at the paint surfaces with a magnifying glass and made 2 small recommendations about the finish on the fender brackets. The third visit was May of 2023, 2 weeks before the fair, when the restoration was complete. He was in the barn for 3 hours that day. He ran the engine, he checked the hydraulics, he tested the throttle response and the magneto timing. He went over every painted surface and every decal and every piece of hardware. He took 40 photographs. He asked Loretta for the 1957 receipt and the parts provenance documentation. Then he sat down at the workbench and wrote the appraisal. "Original spec restoration," he wrote. "Documented provenance to first owner. Senior class quality. Engine mechanical condition, excellent. Body and paint, excellent. Decals and hardware, exact period correct specification. Hydraulics, fully functional. Overall condition, among the top 5 WD-45 restorations I have evaluated in my career." He put the value at the bottom, $38,000. He handed Loretta the document. She read it once, standing at the workbench. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He offered me $800. Harold said, "I know." She looked at the WD-45. The overhead light made the Persian orange very warm in the barn's interior. The decals were exact. The engine was quiet under the hood, not running now, but containing the fact of its having run, containing the proof that the work had been done and done right. "I want to bring it to the fair," she said. Harold said, "I'm the senior judge this year." She looked at him. "I nominated it before you had a chance to enter it yourself," he said. "Dorothy Pratt has the paperwork." At the Kerrville equipment auction in March of the previous year, Tom Pickard had seen Loretta buying a parts lot for Alice Chalmers' machines. He had been at the auction himself. There was a line of hydraulic equipment he was interested in, and he had watched her go through the parts table at the preview with the deliberate focus of someone who knew what she was looking for. He had made his comment to the room. Several people laughed. Curtis Bell, who was 3 rows away, heard every word. He called Loretta that evening. She thanked him. She asked how the carburetor was coming along. He said it was coming along fine. She had not asked for sympathy. She did not expect it. She had been a farmer's wife in the Texas Hill Country for 30 years, and she had learned to locate her feelings in the work rather than in other people's approval of it. Tom Pickard's opinion of the project was relevant to Tom Pickard. It was not relevant to the bearing surfaces inside the rebuilt engine or the adhesion quality of the Persian orange paint. When Tom came by the farm the following summer, the unannounced visit, the gentle speech, she had listened without interrupting. He had said he didn't want to see her be disappointed. She had told him Harold Eames had been by. She had watched his expression change at the name. He had known who Harold was. Every implement dealer in the state knew who Harold Eames was. Harold's appraisals were the standard in Texas estate proceedings and insurance disputes. An appraisal from Harold was not a hobby opinion. It was a document with legal standing. Tom had left without saying much else. She had gone back to the barn and worked on the fender brackets until dark. The morning of the fair was clear and warm. She trailered the WD-45 to the fairgrounds at 7 o'clock and backed it into the show ring position while the ring was still quiet. She put down chocks and stood back and looked at it in the morning light. The color was right. The color was very right. Harold arrived at 8 with his judge's folder. They exchanged a few words. He went to the judge's table. She stayed with the tractor. Tom arrived at 9, with his display tent and 2 salespeople and a pair of new utility tractors on a flatbed. He set up across the aisle from the show ring and did not come over immediately. She could see him from the ring. She watched him notice the WD-45. She watched him look at it for a moment and then look away. He came to the ring rope at about 9:15. He said what he said to Walter. She heard it. The distance was 40 feet, and his voice was not quiet. At 11 o'clock, Harold Eames walked from the judge's table to the show ring with the blue ribbon and the appraisal certificate and stopped beside the WD-45. Senior restoration class. First place, he said. He was speaking to the crowd at the ring, but he had a voice that carried. The 1957 Alice Chalmers WD-45 of Loretta Greer, Kendall County. He paused. Appraised value, $38,000. He turned to look at Loretta. The finest Texas-built restoration I have evaluated in 11 years of judging this class. He held out the ribbon. She took it with both hands. She held it for a moment, then reached up and hung it from the WD-45 steering wheel. The ribbon falling against the polished spokes, the color of it bright against the Persian orange behind it. Somewhere in the fair behind her, a livestock announcer was talking through a PA system. Somewhere a child was calling for someone. The ordinary noise of a county fair going about its business. At the ring rope, Tom Pickard stood without moving. The dealer beside him, the one he had told about the $800 boat anchor, looked at Tom and then at the ribbon and did not say anything. Another dealer a step behind said quietly, 38. Tom's face was not red. It was the other thing, the color that comes when certainty drains out and what is left behind is just a man standing at a rope, holding opinions that the morning had made small. Loretta did not look at him. She looked at the tractor. She put her hand on the hood. The paint was warm from the sun. Under it, contained in the metal, was the shape of the machine her grandfather had driven off a dealer's lot in April of 1957 and run for 32 years on this hill country ground. That was still there. That had never left. Within 2 weeks of the fair, 3 collectors had contacted the Hill Country Antique Power Association looking for Loretta's contact information, all wanting to purchase the WD-45. She declined. She had not built it to sell. She had not built it for the blue ribbon, though the blue ribbon was wonderful. She had built it because it was worth building, and that had been true before Harold Eames's appraisal, and before Tom Pickard's $800 offer, and before she understood what the project was going to mean to her. The award citation ran in 2 regional papers. Curtis Bell was named in Loretta's public thank you. He called her when he saw his name in print and said he was glad she had called him. She said she was glad too. Harold called in the spring of the following year to ask if he could include the WD-45 photographs in the Restoration Standards Guide he was writing for the association. She said yes, on the condition that the original receipt was reproduced alongside the photographs, the carbon copy page, Earl Whiting's name, April 14, 1957, to $100. Harold said that was exactly what he had hoped she would say. She had the guide framed when it came out. It hung in the barn, near the WD-45's usual spot, with the photograph of the engine and the appraisal figure and the old receipt reproduced in the corner. Tom Pickard did not mention the WD-45 at the feed store again. He did not stop at Loretta's farm again. He was still in business in Kendall County, still selling new equipment, still knowing the prices of things. He was good at his job, within the boundaries of what his job required him to know. The boundaries of that knowledge had turned out to have edges he hadn't seen. There is a particular courage in doing a thing for its own sake. Not for the money. The WD-45 would never net out, even at $38,000, against the 3 years and the $6,400 Loretta had spent. Not for the vindication, though the vindication had been real and satisfying, and she would not pretend otherwise. But for something harder to name. For the thing you do when you decide that this object, this inheritance, this machine that ran on a hill country farm for 32 years under your grandfather's hands, deserves to run again, that it deserves to be brought back, carefully and correctly, by the person who knows why it matters. Loretta Greer had not known she could do it when she started. She learned she could. That learning was its own value, separate from the appraisal, separate from the ribbon, separate from Tom Pickard's face at the ring rope. You know this feeling, maybe, the project you took on when everyone said it wasn't worth the trouble. The thing you kept when someone offered to take it off your hands. The work you did in the evenings when the barn was quiet and the rest of the world was somewhere else, being very certain about what was worth doing and what wasn't. If you've been in that barn, not Loretta's barn, but your own version of it, the quiet place where you worked on something the world had given up on, leave it in the comments. We want to know what it was. We want to know if it's done. Subscribe and hit the bell, because we have more of these. The Appalachian shepherd who bred for fineness for 34 years while the broker graded him at the bottom of the scale. The widow with the wheat contract and the wheat nobody thought was worth cutting. The old mechanic in South Dakota with a water right from 1887 that stopped a speculator cold. The world is full of people who kept the thing everyone said to let go. We find them. We tell you about them. Every week. We'll see you next time. Loretta ain't the wire brush she bought at the hardware store in Bowen on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 2020, was a standard tool, wooden handle, stiff steel bristles, the kind used for removing rust and old paint from metal surfaces. She had used it for the first time on the WD-45's left rear fender, standing in her barn in jeans and an old shirt with dust on her forearms and rust flakes in her hair. She had no idea what she was doing. She had watched 2 videos on the subject and read the Restoration Standards Guide and talked to Curtis, and she still had no actual feel for the work until her hands were doing it. The first 20 minutes were awkward. Too much pressure. Then, too little. The brush leaving marks she didn't like in the metal. She stopped and looked at what she had done. She started again. By the end of the second hour, she had found the right pressure. The rust was coming off evenly, the bare metal underneath showing clean and gray. She learned that the angle of the brush mattered, that coming in at a slight diagonal produced a better surface than going straight across. She learned that slowing down at the edges prevented the brush from gouging the metal. She was not thinking about Tom Pickard. She was thinking about the angle of the brush. That was what she had not expected about the project, how completely it occupied her. Grief, in the 2 years since Wes had died, had the quality of background noise, always present, modulated but never gone, a companion she had learned to move around. But in the barn, working on the tractor, the grief had no room. Her attention was entirely on the metal and the tool and the question of whether she was doing it right. She thought this must have been what her grandfather felt. She thought this must be one of the things you lose when the machine sits under a tarp for 30 years, not just the use of it, but the particular quality of attention it asked of you. She worked until dark. She went inside and made dinner and went to bed. She went back the following evening. Curtis Bell's shop outside Comfort, was the kind of place that took a few minutes to understand. It was organized by a logic that was not immediately visible, components grouped not alphabetically or by type, but by some system of association and priority that lived entirely in Curtis's memory. He could put his hand on any part in the shop without looking, which he demonstrated on Loretta's third visit when she asked for a WD-45 throttle shaft retaining clip. He had not bought the clip for this project. He had had it for 15 years, acquired as part of a lot at an estate sale, kept because he did not like letting original components go to the landfill. He was a quiet man, in the way of people who were comfortable with silence. He explained things when explanation was needed, and did not when it wasn't. With Loretta, it had taken about 3 visits before they found the rhythm of the working arrangement, she providing the mechanical questions, he providing the answers, and the silence between them filling with the sound of tools and engines. On a Friday afternoon, in November of 2021, the rebuilt engine in the WD-45 turned over under its own power for the first time. Curtis had set up the timing that morning and connected the fuel line and the battery, and they had gone through the startup sequence step by step. The engine caught on the second crank. It settled into idle. The sound was the particular sound of a rebuilt engine, not quite the sound of a broken-in engine. A little too tight, a little too even, but running. Loretta stood beside the tractor and listened to it. Curtis stood on the other side and listened to it. After about a minute he said, "Sounds good." "It does," she said. They stood there for another minute. Then Curtis reached over and shut it down, because there was still more work to do before they could let it run long, and breaking in a rebuilt engine required patience and a specific incremental schedule that he had written out for her on a note card. She drove home with the note card on the passenger seat. She thought about the sound of the engine for most of the drive. The first morning in the showring, she arrived at the fairgrounds at 6:45, before most of the other exhibitors. The showring was empty, except for a county worker spreading fresh sand on the low spots near the center. She backed the trailer into the unloading area and brought the WD-45 down the ramp slowly, the Persian orange, very bright in the early morning light. She drove it to its assigned position in the ring and set the brake and climbed down. She walked around it once. She looked at every surface. She looked at the fenders and the hood and the dash plate with the serial number and the restored decals and the engine bay and the tire sidewalls, which she had dressed with a tire treatment that made the old rubber look almost new. She found 2 small things she wanted to touch up. A micro scratch on the right fender she hadn't seen in the barn's light. A fingerprint on the hood, and she wiped them down with a clean cloth from her kit. She stepped back and looked at the machine in the morning. You know what a good restoration looks like. You know it not from a spec sheet, but from the particular quality of attention it shows. The accumulated decisions about which things matter and which can be let go. Every surface carries the mark of the person who did the work. Loretta had put 3 years into this. The machine wore those years well. She put on the chocks, opened the hood to show the engine, and stood back to wait for the morning. The talk at the feed store, Tom Pickard had been talking about the project at the Bergheim feed store for 2 years. Not constantly, he was not the kind of man who made a long entertainment of someone else's foolishness, but regularly enough that several of the store's regular customers had a picture of the situation from his version of it. A widow, 60-some years old, pouring money into a non-running WD-45 because of sentimental attachment. A project that didn't pencil out by any reasonable measure. He was not being cruel about it. He was being analytical, which he understood to be a form of public service, helping other farmers calibrate their expectations about what old equipment was worth. He had not updated his analysis since the summer visit, when he had seen the work in progress and heard Harold Eames's name. He had not called to ask about the project status. He had not driven by the farm. He had let the analysis sit at the figure he had arrived at 2 years earlier, $800, scrap by weight, and continued to reference it at the feed store as a data point. The morning after the fair, the feed store was quieter about the subject than it had been in 2 years. Not quiet because no one knew, almost everyone knew, or had heard from someone who was at the fair, but quiet in the particular way of a conversation whose premise has been removed. Tom came in at 8 o'clock. He bought what he needed. He talked about the price of diesel and the delivery schedule for a seed order he was waiting on, and the extended forecast, which had the county looking at a dry October. Nobody brought up the WD-45. He drove back to the dealership. He opened his office and sat down at his desk and looked at the window for a while. The morning was clear, and the hill country outside the window was cedar and limestone, and the particular dry green of Texas in early fall. He thought about $38,000. He thought about $800. He thought about the 47 times the number 38,000 was greater than 800. He thought about Harold Eames in the show ring, holding the ribbon, reading the citation. He was not a man given to sustained self-recrimination. He was a practical man, and he believed in learning from errors and moving forward. But he sat at the desk for longer than usual that morning before starting his calls. Earl Whiting's receipt. Loretta had the receipt framed. Not immediately, she kept it in the coffee can for most of the restoration, taking it out occasionally to look at the typewritten figures. Alice Chalmers WD-45, serial K117482, sold to Earl Whiting, April 14, 1957, $2,100. She had done the arithmetic on it once, sitting at the kitchen table. $2,100 in 1957 was the equivalent of roughly $22,000 today. A significant purchase. Earl had bought the machine when he was in his early 50s, at a time when the farm was his primary income, and decisions of that size were not casual. He had driven it for 32 years. She had spent $400 on the restoration, parts, materials, Harold's consulting fee, the decals, the paint, the miscellaneous hardware that adds up across 3 years of careful work. She had also spent 3 years of evenings and weekends. She had not counted those. The machine was now worth, according to Harold's appraisal, $38,000, which meant that between Earl's purchase price and Harold's appraisal figure, across 66 years, the machine had appreciated by approximately $15,900 in real terms, less than the cost of a year's feed for a modest livestock operation, but also more than nothing, and more than Tom Pickard's $800, and more than the nothing it would have been worth to anyone once the barn collapsed over it. She was not building a financial case. She knew the numbers didn't tell the whole story. They never do with these things. The receipt was not evidence of a sound investment. It was evidence of a man who bought a good machine in 1957 and ran it for 32 years and put it in a barn, covered with a tarp, and left it for his granddaughter to find. She framed it alongside the fair citation, on the barn wall above the workbench, where the light hit it in the mornings. The wire brush was on the shelf below. She had kept it without knowing why, and now she knew. It was the first tool. It was where the work had started. Harold's Guide, the Restoration Standards Guide that Harold Eames published through the Hill Country Antique Power Association, came out in February of the following year. It was a practical document, specifications, photographs, grading criteria, intended as a reference for restoration judges and a resource for restorers. Loretta's WD-45 appeared twice, once in the Senior Class Restoration Standards section as a benchmark example of original spec finish quality, and once in the Provenance Documentation section, with the 1957 receipt reproduced in facsimile. The caption under the receipt read, "Original Purchase Documentation, Earl Whiting, 1957. Documentation of this type, establishing unbroken first owner provenance, is a significant contributor to appraised value." Harold called her when the guide went to print. He said the WD-45 was the clearest example he had found in 11 years of judging of what a personal restoration project could achieve when the restorer applied both research and patience in equal measure. She thanked him. He said, "Thank Curtis and thank Earl." She said, "I always do." The barn in late afternoon, the WD-45 had its permanent spot in the front bay of the barn now. Not under a tarp, not pushed to the back. Loretta had hung a chain from the ceiling at the right height to lift the hood for display, and she kept the engine clean and the paint polished and the tires dressed. She started it once a month and let it run for 15 minutes in the yard. This was partly maintenance, keeping the engine from sitting too long, the fluids moving, and partly something else. The sound of it in the yard was a particular sound. The sound of a machine that had been running on this hill country ground since before Loretta was born, and would, if she maintained it right, keep running after she was gone. In the late afternoons, the sun came through the west door of the barn and lay across the hood in a particular way. The Persian orange caught it differently than most colors. It didn't reflect so much as absorb the light and hold it, so that the tractor seemed to generate a kind of warmth from within. She would sit in the barn sometimes in those late afternoons with a cup of coffee and look at it. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She was simply present with the machine, which had been her grandfather's and was now hers, which had been abandoned and was now found, which had been worth nothing and was worth $38,000. Not that the dollar figure was the point. The point was the afternoon light on the Persian orange paint. The point was the 1957 receipt on the wall and the blue ribbon on the steering wheel and the wire brush on the shelf. The point was a machine brought back to life by a woman who hadn't known she could do it, who had learned she could, who had done it right. That was the point. That had always been the point. We have told you Loretta Greer's story because it is the kind of story that doesn't usually get told. It is too quiet. It has no lawsuit, no courtroom. It has a woman in a barn with a wire brush, a retired mechanic who knew the difference between a salvageable bore and one that wasn't, and an appraiser who drove to a farm 3 times because the work impressed him. And it has a moment in a show ring at 11 in the morning when a number was read aloud and the certainty of a man who had been wrong for 2 years became very small. That is enough. That is more than enough. Subscribe if this kind of story is the kind of story you want more of. And it is there every week. Because the hill country and the Blue Ridge and the Kansas wheat fields and the North Dakota hop yards are full of people doing quiet things correctly. And most of them never get a channel. But they get this one. Tell us in the comments about the thing you restored, or the thing you kept, or the quiet work you did when everyone said it didn't pencil out. We read every one. We'll see you next week.